You can easily use this 3D animation on any website and create it with completely free tools. In this tutorial I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so firstly we need something like the character you see in the animation. So I already made this character. I can show you in another tutorial how to make something like this. It's pretty easy. You basically go from like a primitive form and start to like extrude everything and then put in Cinema 4D some subdivision surface on it to make it more smooth and so on and so forth. You can do the exactly same thing in Blender, which is completely free, as you hopefully know. And you can also do this in Normit Sculpt if you're mostly working on a tablet, for example. So this is what we start with, and then we go to Mixamo, which I will show you right now. Mixamo is a website where you can upload your characters and then rig them automatically and also add animations. It's owned by Adobe right now, so they have a pretty big library of animations and you can find almost anything here. So it's a great starting point if you haven't rigged or modeled any character before. So now if we press next, we can start to put the joints and everything here. So here's the chin, then we got the wrists, that's like about here. And then the elbows, that's around here. The knees we put here, and then the groin down here. So that's basically it. And then it starts calculating, which might take up to 2 minutes as it says. But then you can use any of these animations on the website, which is great. So the animation you saw in the preview is also an animation I took from here. So it's a great starting point, as I say, if you don't know how to rig yet, or if you don't know how to make an animation yet, that's like a great starting point. So let's wait until the auto rigger has done its job and it's loading, so it looks fine. And this looks, you know, like we could optimize this, but it looks pretty fine. So I think we can say next, and I already had it imported, so we can overwrite it. So what I used was the set walk, I think it's called, very descriptive. And I like to put like the animation to in place so that it keeps walking in place, which is much more helpful. And then you can already start downloading it. You can do like a bit more like stuff like that. You can change the overdrive, the arm space and stuff like that. But usually it's pretty good at default. So I set it back to default and then download it. I usually download it as an animated FBX because I'm used to importing FBX models. I export with skin and no keyframe reduction, although you can do that. And I usually use frames per second of 30 because it doesn't really matter for our purposes right now. I mean, just do as works best for you. So once we download it, we can jump over to Codepen and start adding some Three.js. So if we close Mixamo and go to Codepen, we can already see this here. So this is the code that I'm basically using for all my projects. This is my starter code. So you can just use it the same, like you can use it as a starter for yourself. So just copy paste it and see what you do with it. But I will try to explain a little bit what is happening here. So the HTML and CSS is not really important. It looks like a lot, but most of it is just the SVGs, the vector icons. Where is it? Down here, right? So these are the icons that are imported in my HTML. And importantly, though, I import a canvas down here, and I will make it a bit bigger so you can see more easily if you are looking on a phone, for example. So here we got the canvas, and that's going to be important because this is where we send our animation to, our scene to, from the JavaScript part of the code. And this, again, doesn't really matter too much, besides the fact that I do have some styling on the canvas. It's just height and width 100% and z-index 0, so I can put stuff on top of it. Nothing too complicated, nothing too exciting. It should be pretty straightforward, and you can just copy paste it and adapt it for your project as much as you need it. Then I'm importing all the stuff that I'm using from Three.js, like first and foremost Three.js. I use version 136. I used to do some other stuff which didn't quite work in later versions, so just see what version works best for you and I guess stick with it for as long as it makes sense. So I'm in version 136, things might change after that, and I import the RGBE loader. So that is the thing that allows us to use an HDR and use a dome light. It has different names in different 3D programs, but basically use an HDR. The effect composer will help us to add the effects later on. The render pass, I'm not perfectly sure right now what we need that for. I think we would need that for the pixel shader, but I don't think it's important right now. Anyway, I use an after image pass and Unreal Bloom pass and shader pass, FBX loader. So these are the ones I'm using. Maybe I don't even need all of them right now, but that's a good starting point. Then I'm declaring just a few things that I will use later. So I have a composer, I have the body mixer and the eye mixer, and a theta, which I set to 0 at this point. Importantly or interestingly, I import like 2 different models here. You could, and I will explain that later briefly, you could also, I think, work with selections, but I always found it easier just to import like different parts of a 3D model, which I assign different materials. So here, as you will see later, the eyes have different materials. So that's why I use a body and an eye mixer, because I import the body and the eyes separately. Then we set up the renderer. That is like copy-paste code. I have a clock here that we will use for the animation later. I set the clear color, which is the background. And again, some like boilerplate stuff that you will basically use in almost every project. So I set the pixel ratio and the size of the renderer, and then we create the scene. So this is just basic setup. Then almost one of the most important things for my personal style is this environment light, or dome light, or HDR, however you like to call that, or however you're used to call it from your 3D program. So this basically determines the whole look of the scene. So it gives all the light. I rarely ever use, I mean, sometimes I use additional lights, but this is kind of the basic setup. So you can already see I put some of my other HDRs here as well. So if we comment that one out and, for example, use this one, we will see how that changes the scene. So this is like a very bluish gradient. So now it looks completely different, basically, right? So that's that, and we might check another one. Some might have like, some might seem darker. Like this one, for example, you would have to make the intensity a bit higher, but that I usually do in the material later. So anyway, let's stick with this blue one for the moment. Here I'm just adding it for the mapping, and here I add it to the scene. Again, stuff that you just copy paste. Then I'm adding a camera, nothing too exciting either. So here we have the field of view. So that is what you might be used to when you have a focal length. So other than with a focal length, this is not 45 millimeters, but it is the field of view. So if we make this smaller, we zoom in. So that's something to keep in mind if you are new. So right now you see the blob is a bit bigger, but that's only because we zoomed in. So we can just keep that for now. Here I'm setting the camera position, which for the moment right now it doesn't really have an effect because it's going to be overwritten by the animation later. But if you stop the animation, for example, this will be the regular position that it will go back to. And here I'm doing the material next. So that's basically the next most important thing, because we need something that reflects the HDR that we set earlier. So I have this blob material and I give it the color of white, which helps for the reflection. So white reflects better. If we would put this, for example, to black, so that would be 006 times, that would look pretty bad. You know, like you can still see something there, but just black doesn't reflect too much. So if we put it to like 50, 50, 50, something like that, that's a bit lighter, so you will see a bit more reflections, but not too much. So it makes sense for my style to go with white. So we take all the color from the HDR, basically. I like to add some roughness to it, so it's not like super shiny. We could also like put roughness to 0, but then it would have this like very shiny, plasticky look. I mean, right now not so much because the fog is so extreme, but if we would add, for example, some metalness to it, it would relatively quickly become very shiny, as you can see now. Like basically it completely reflects the HDR now, which might be something that you want to do, but for this scene, I didn't really like it. So I think here the roughness at 0.3 and the metalness at 0 helps. I just declare the metalness here as a reminder that it's set to 0 and that I could change it if I would want to. Now this one is important as well because I tell the material here to use my HDR as its environment map. I think it does that by default, but just I keep it there to have a reminder that I'm doing that. And then I declare how much of an effect it has. So I declare the environment map intensity. So if we would lower that value, we would see less of a reflection. Like now it would be pretty dark because we only affect like 10%, the HDR by 10%. And if we put it to 1, it's like super glowy, like glowing a lot. We can even put like values above 1, which will almost break the scene, but it's possible, you know, like that looks cool in a way as well. So maybe that's a look that you're after, and then you can even go above 1. But for me, for my purpose, 0.5 worked pretty well for this HDR and this scene. Right, and then I have just a very basic material that I use for the eyes, as you can see here. They are not supposed to reflect the HDR, just to give it a bit of contrast. And there I put the environment map, but I put the intensity to 0, which I wouldn't have to do because I'm also declaring the emissiveness. I could also change the emissiveness intensity, I think. But basically emissiveness means that this material is not affected by the light that is pointed towards it. So it doesn't reflect light. So I am just setting here the color that I earlier set as my background color. So it kind of, as you can see here, is a clear color. So I basically just use the background color as like a reference point for this. So this is almost like the most important stuff. But I mean, that's the most important stuff to determine the look of it. But we still didn't import any model. So if you just did that, like nothing happens, right? So here I first set the scale for later, so I can just scale everything up together, since I'm using different models that take the same, that have the same position and are supposed to have the same scale. Then I declare my FBX loader, which is this constant new FBX loader. I load my model, which I take from my GitHub here, which is a thing that you should note if you are intending to use Codepen as well. You would need a premium subscription to use your own assets, but you can also upload them to GitHub and then import them from GitHub. So if you want to know more about that, I can make a tutorial about that as well. Just let me know in the comments. But for the moment, just import your model. Like if you are using Visual Studio Code, just import your model there, or if you program somewhere else. And then I'm adding the animation. So I got the body mixer, and that takes the animation mixer. Not too much happening here. This is just like copy paste stuff again. Just use that in every scene anyway. So then I do the traverse, which I think I would not have to do. I think I just got used to it because I had to do it for one project and I just copy pasted from there. But anyway, here I'm adding the material to the child. I think in principle you could add stuff to selections here. I think this is what traverse could help with, but I never did that, so I cannot tell you too much about that. Anyway, I am adding the material, so I got the blob material here, and then I set the position. Again, I think I could or should use some variable for the position because it's the same for both of my things that I import, but anyway, it is what it is. Not every code is perfect, but you get the point, I hope. So next I set the scale, which I use my variable for, which I could also do for my position set. And then I add the object to the scene. Again, a thing that happens to me as well all the time. You might do all the code and then you realize like, why is it not showing up? And often enough, I forget to do the scene.add. So as long as you don't do scene.add and then declare what you add, it doesn't show up. So make sure you add everything to your scene. And then basically we can skip this here. This is just the same thing I do for the eyes. As I told you, I imported them as like 2 different objects. So that's what I did. And here I just added the different material to it. So we get to the next important thing that is important for my particular style. So for one, I use this regular fog, which I don't really need to set in this scene. Because what this is, it takes a color. So this is the color that the fog fades into. And this is the near value and this is the far value. So I think it shows everything between the near and the far value, and then it fades off to the background color. So this is nice if you have like a big scene, like say you are showing a whole city and you want to fade the city to this color, like as with a fog in Redshift, it would be an environment, for example. You would use that. Since I really only use this character here, there's nothing like in the background, it doesn't really have an effect, so if I would comment it out, nothing would happen. So when I only use this kind of thing, where I don't really want to fade into the background, but only want to give it this general look of fog, I like to use this FogExp2, which doesn't take a near and far value in Three.js, but it takes a density, I think it's called. Intensity or density? I think it's called density. So this is, as the name suggests, just how dense the fog is. So, for example, this plays together with the other stuff as well, but if this scene would now be too dark for me, I would go lower with the density. So now it should be relatively brighter. Maybe here you cannot see it because it's not too obvious, but if we go to like something like 0.05, you can already see it's getting brighter. Reversely, if we go to a higher value like 0.03, you can barely even see anything, which again has a cool look to it. Like now it almost looks like a toon shader or something like that. But anyway, I found that, that point, where did we have it? I lost it. 0.015 works pretty well for this particular scene. So next we just start the post-processing, and here we first do a new render pass, right? So this is how we initialize the post-processing, and then I first add in after image pass. It's kind of difficult to explain in words what the after image does. It's obvious when you see it, but it's difficult to put into words. So I like to call it a drag, like the stuff is dragging, the edges are dragging. So if I would put this to like a really high value, like 0.99 would basically break it, but I think you can then like understand like how it's dragging. Like here you can see like the edges are basically like overwriting the background in this case. So this again could be a look that you're after. I'm not, so I like to keep it at like somewhere between like 0.85 to like 0.95. That's like the kind of range that works well for me. And this one doesn't really play together with other effects, so you can almost independently do that, which is not the case for the bloom. So here I start the bloom. The bloom has like a few lines of code, but only because I set my parameters in a constant, so it's easier to see for me. And here you will have to keep in mind, if you are using the fog from earlier that I told you about, this will play together with how you do your bloom. For example, if you put a lot of fog on the scene, you can kind of change the darkness to make it brighter by going higher with the values you put into the bloom. For example, if this would be too dark for me right now, I could go with a way higher bloom strength, and it would kind of make up for all the fog that we use. So if you make the fog higher and it gets too dark, you might go back to the bloom and add some more bloom to it. It just depends on how you want to approach it. So these are the values that work well for me. And you can just basically copy paste them or see how it works together with the distance, for example, of the object to the camera and the fog. So these are like the things that you will want to keep in mind when you are deciding how much bloom you want to use. And then basically here I'm just adding everything to the composer. So the composer is the thing that puts all the effects together and sends it to the renderer. And then there's just like some other stuff happening here, like the resize is another copy-paste thing. The update function I'm calling doesn't do too much besides the fact that it's animating the camera. So I told you earlier the values we set for the camera are overwritten by what is happening here in the update function. So I'm using the theta1 here, but you can give it any name, and I give it a plus equals of 0.005. So it counts up for every time the update function is called by this value. So if I would, for example, make this higher, we would have a quicker rising number. Right? So I think, yes, this would just make the animation really, really fast. You could basically also use the clock here, but I just got used to doing this like plus equals thing. And then I do the camera position. So in order to move around it in circles, which I like to do for my scenes, for one, it's nice if you paid attention to math classes in school. But basically, I figured at some point that you can just use the sine function and the cos function on x and z axis, so you have this way of going around in a circle around the object that is positioned at 0, 0 in terms of x and z in this case. And then I like to do like this up and downwards movement, which is just another cos function, and add an offset of plus 20, so it's a bit higher. As you can see, it only moves like in this angle from above. One thing that you will have to keep in mind is that you keep the camera look at from Three.js inside of the update function, because otherwise the camera doesn't really know where it's looking at, and then this circle doesn't really work because you're not looking at the center anymore. So here I'm looking at the position, I think it's X, Y, Z here. So at like basically at the middle, like at a bit like 5 units up on the Y axis. So keep in mind that you add the camera look at if you want to move around something, and that it keeps like looking at the same position. Then again, we have like an on resize function, which just takes care of when we resize our window, just the copy paste thing. And then last but not least, I have this function animate, which takes the clock from the very beginning, as you remember, and it gets the delta value. So we just have a value that's counting up. And we add the 2 mixers here. So they are responsible for updating our animation so that the animation runs smoothly and continuously. So we just update the mixer. And here again, I like to, I think for most animations I take from Mixamo, I like to have them more like a slow-mo effect. So I just divide this value by 2. So if we would, in contrast, multiply this by 2, it would be, I guess, 4 times as fast, right? So now it's like this running blob. By the way, just a quick tip, if you want to change like 2 rows at the same time, you can just press Control or Command and then like add as many positions that you want to mark. Then I call the update function as we declared like all the stuff here, so it keeps like updating, and we have the composer rendering, nothing too crazy, and we request the animation frame, which happens inside of the animate function and outside. So we have this continuous animation. And that's basically it. Like that's everything that's happening. And it's really not too complicated. There are a few values you can play around with, like the HDR again, for example. And you can just play around with the values you want to put in and see what works best for you. You can play around with the fog or the after image or the HDR, the intensity, the materials, and kind of figure out what works best for you. So that's it. If you want to learn more about this, let me know in the comments. If you want to know how I sculpted or modeled this character, just let me know as well. I can also give you a tutorial about that. Other than that, you can also find my other scenes on my Codepen page. Everything is linked in the description. and you can find like other scenes, and if there's something in particular, for example, my surface imperfections here, just let me know in the comments and I'll give you a tutorial for that as well. So that's that. You can find my social media in the description as well, and please subscribe and like this video to help me give you more tutorials in the future. And thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one.